Marcus Hale had spent 17 years walking trails that most people would never find on any map. Not the polished hiking paths with painted markers and wooden signposts. Not the maintained fire roads that rangers drove along in comfortable trucks. He walked the kind of ground that swallowed sound whole, where the wind moved through canyon walls like a held breath, and where the land did not care whether you were prepared or not. He was a wilderness ranger assigned to a sector of the high desert that bordered the edge of a national conservation zone in the southwest, a stretch of country that looked, from a distance, like the end of the world. Red rock formations jutted out of the earth at odd angles, as though the ground had cracked open long ago and never healed properly. Juniper trees clung to exposed ridgelines with roots like old knuckles. Dry creek beds ran in twisting lines across the canyon floors, carrying water only a handful of weeks each year when the rains came hard and fast and left just as quickly. Most rangers who passed through that sector asked for transfers within a year. The isolation wore on them. The silence was a different kind than the peaceful, quiet people imagined when they thought of the outdoors. It was deeper, almost pressurized, the kind of silence that made a man aware of every sound his own body produced. The creak of a boot on dry stone. The shallow rhythm of breath. The faint click of a canteen being opened. Out there, you heard yourself with an uncomfortable clarity that most people spent their whole lives running from. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Marcus had never asked for a transfer. He had never wanted one. He was not an easy man to describe in simple terms. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, though the sun and the years of exposed weather had carved lines into his face that made him look older at certain angles. He was lean in the way that comes not from discipline at a gym, but from simply never stopping. He had a quiet way of moving, deliberate and unhurried, that animals sometimes did not register as a threat until he was already close. He had grown up in a small high-desert town not far from the sector he now patrolled, the kind of town that shrank a little more each decade as the young people left and the old people stayed, and the businesses along the main road closed one by one. He had not left. Not permanently. He had gone away briefly for training, for a short stretch of time when he thought he might want something different, but the desert had pulled him back the way it always did. He understood it in a way he understood almost nothing else. The land made sense to him. People, he had found over the years, rarely did. His daily routine was simple and rarely deviated. He rose before the sun had fully cleared the horizon, made coffee in a battered tin percolator that had belonged to the ranger who trained him, and sat outside his station cabin for a few minutes, watching the sky shift from black to purple to that particular shade of burnt orange that the desert morning produced like nothing else on earth. Then he loaded his pack, checked his radio, laced his boots, and went to work. His sector covered nearly 40 square miles of protected land. He knew every significant formation by name, every seasonal spring, every known cave entrance, every trail that was official, and every game path that wasn't. He kept meticulous logs. He photographed unusual erosion patterns, tracked the movement of wildlife, documented any sign of trespassers or unauthorized activity. He filed his reports without complaint and without drama. He was, by any measure, exactly the kind of ranger that remote wilderness needed and almost never got. A man who actually loved the place he was assigned to protect. That particular morning in late October had started as every other morning did. The air carried the smell of cold stone and the faint sweetness of dried sage. A pair of ravens circled lazily above the eastern ridge, their calls drifting down into the canyon below like distant comments on matters too small to concern them. Marcus adjusted the straps of his pack, felt the familiar weight settle across his shoulders, and began walking. He had planned to check a section of the canyon wall that he had not visited in several weeks, a stretch of exposed rock face on the northern arm of the canyon that had shown some unusual surface cracking during his last inspection. Freeze-thaw cycles in the rock could be dangerous. Sections of cliff that looked stable from a distance could shift suddenly, and he had learned long ago not to take stability for granted in this country. The walk to that section of the canyon took just over 2 hours on foot, following a combination of dry wash beds and a narrow game trail that wound up through a series of shallow terraces before dropping back down into the canyon proper. Marcus moved at his usual pace, neither rushed nor slow, his eyes scanning the ground and walls around him out of habit, so deeply ingrained it no longer required conscious thought. He noticed a fresh mountain lion track in a patch of damp clay near a seep spring. He crouched, studying it for a moment, judging the age by how much the edges had dried and blurred. Recent, perhaps the night before. He photographed it and moved on. He was approximately 40 minutes from his destination when his radio crackled with a routine check-in from the sector station. He confirmed his position and his planned route. The dispatcher, a young woman named Priya who had been working the desk for less than a year, mentioned that a small weather system was moving in from the northwest and that he might see some cloud cover by early afternoon. He thanked her, clicked off, and continued walking. The canyon wall he had been heading toward came into view as he rounded a long curve in the dry wash. It was a dramatic piece of geology, a sheer face of layered sandstone that rose nearly 60 feet above the canyon floor, its surface banded in shades of rust and cream and deep burgundy, where different mineral deposits had accumulated over millions of years. Marcus had always found this particular wall striking. It had the kind of ancient authority that made him feel, not small exactly, but appropriately aware of his own brief position in time. He had intended to walk the base of the wall from south to north, checking the lower sections for new fracture lines, looking for any areas where the rock appeared to be separating. He had done this inspection before and expected it to take about 30 minutes before he turned back toward his return route. He had not been walking along the base for more than 10 minutes when he stopped. He stopped because something was wrong, not in a way he could immediately articulate, not in a way that would have made sense to someone who did not spend their days and years reading landscape the way other people read text. But something was off about this section of the wall. He stood completely still, eyes moving slowly across the rock face in front of him. The surface here was heavily shadowed, the angle of the morning light throwing the irregularities of the stone into sharp contrast. There was a section roughly 20 feet from where he stood where the shadow seemed too deep, too dark for the angle of the light, too uniform in its shape to be simply a natural recess in the stone. Marcus stepped closer. His boots moved quietly on the loose gravel of the canyon floor. He stopped again, tilting his head slightly. The shadow was not a shadow at all. It was a seam, a perfectly vertical line running from approximately knee height to roughly chest level, intersecting at its top and bottom with two horizontal lines of identical quality. It formed the unmistakable outline of a rectangle. He reached out and pressed his fingertips against the rock face. His fingers did not meet stone. They met metal, cold and solid beneath a surface of applied texture, something that had been made to look like the surrounding sandstone, coated or painted or treated in some way that had fooled every passing eye, including his own, for however long it had been there. He pulled his hand back slowly, ran his fingers over the seam again, tracing its line. The join was tight, but not perfect. Time and the elements had worked at it, and in the places where the sealant had shrunk and cracked, he could feel the clear, hard edge of iron beneath. Someone had sealed a door into the cliff face, and they had gone to considerable lengths to make sure no one would ever find it. Marcus felt a cold current move through him that had nothing to do with the October air. He had worked this canyon for the better part of a decade. He had walked this wall more times than he could count. He had never seen this before. Or rather, he had never noticed it, which was not the same thing, and the difference between those two facts troubled him in a way that was difficult to name. How long had this been here? Who had put it here? And more urgently, what was on the other side? He stepped back and looked at the surrounding wall with fresh eyes, trying to see past the habit of familiarity that had made him stop noticing what he thought he already knew. The rock surface directly around the door had been treated carefully. The coating was thick enough to blend convincingly with the natural stone at any normal viewing distance, and the canyon wall in this section was not somewhere a person would ordinarily press their face against. It sat in a shadowed alcove, partially tucked behind a natural protrusion of rock that made it even harder to see unless you were specifically looking at the wall from an angle that very few people would ever find themselves in. Even the approach to it was subtly obscured, the gravel in front of it no different from the gravel everywhere else along the canyon floor. Marcus photographed it carefully, methodically, taking multiple angles. His radio sat on his hip, and for a long moment he considered calling it in immediately, getting someone else involved, following the protocol that said you reported unusual findings before you investigated them personally. It was the right procedure. He knew it was the right procedure. He had followed the right procedure for 17 years. He reached for the radio, and then he stopped. Because the thing that had kept him in this canyon for 17 years, the thing that had made him good at this job when other rangers came and went, was not just the discipline of following protocol. It was the instinct to understand a place before he made noise about it. To know what he was dealing with before he invited the kind of response that could not be taken back. Whatever was behind that door, whoever had put it there, had done so very deliberately. They had gone to extraordinary lengths to ensure it would not be found. If there was any chance this was something that required a careful, quiet approach rather than a loud one, calling it in prematurely could change everything. He put the radio back. He pressed his hands against the surface of the door again, feeling its edges more deliberately this time. It did not have an obvious handle or locking mechanism on the exterior. That made sense. A door designed to be invisible would not have an obvious handle. But something had to allow it to open, some mechanism that could be operated from outside if necessary. He moved his fingers along the side of the seam, pressing gently at different points. Nothing at first. Then, near the lower right corner, at a spot where the coating had cracked and peeled back slightly, he felt a slight give. Not a hinge point, something else. A depression, circular, almost like the port of a combination lock sunk flush with the metal surface. He examined it more closely, bringing his flashlight up to illuminate the recess. Inside, he could see the remnants of what appeared to be a numeric dial, corroded almost beyond recognition, but still present. Whatever mechanism had once secured this door, time had gotten to it. The corrosion was significant. Years of temperature cycling, of moisture finding its way into the seam, had done what the hidden location alone might not have done indefinitely. Marcus retrieved a short pry tool from his pack, a multi-purpose instrument he carried for trail maintenance, and worked the tip carefully into the lower seam. He did not force it. He applied slow, even pressure, testing the resistance. On his third attempt, something shifted. A sound, muffled but distinct, like a bolt releasing from deep inside the metal, moved through the rock against his palm. The door did not swing open. It released, the tension in the seam changing, and Marcus had to use both hands to pull it outward. It moved on hinges that screamed against corrosion, a sound that cut through the canyon silence with painful clarity and sent the ravens far above lifting from their perch in alarm. He winced at the noise, as though his own instincts were warning him that he had just done something irreversible. But the door came open. A foot, then 2 feet, then enough to reveal the darkness beyond. He stopped and simply stood at the threshold for a moment. The air that came out of the opening was different. Cooler than the canyon outside. Yes, that was expected from any enclosed space in the rock. But there was something else in it. Not the mineral damp of a natural cave. Something older. Something that carried within it a faint and deeply unsettling suggestion of having once belonged to human beings and now belonging to no one at all. Marcus clicked on his flashlight and shone it into the darkness. The beam revealed a passage. Smooth concrete walls, not the rough-cut walls of a hand-dug tunnel, but formed concrete, poured and finished with the kind of precision that required equipment and planning. The floor was also concrete, flat and even, though covered in a fine layer of dust and scattered debris that had blown in through the seam over years. The passage ran straight for perhaps 30 feet before curving to the right and disappearing from the flashlight's reach. Embedded in the ceiling at intervals were the rusted remnants of electrical conduit, the wire long stripped or rotted away, the mounting brackets still in place. This had been a wired installation. At some point, this passage had been lit. He stood at the entrance for another moment, his mind moving through what he was seeing and what it implied. Concrete construction, electrical wiring, a door designed to be permanently hidden from the outside. These things did not describe anything that belonged in a protected wilderness canyon in the southwest. They described something that had been built here specifically because no one was supposed to find it. Something that had required significant resources and planning, and that had been executed with the intention of permanence. Marcus stepped inside. The floor held his weight without any flex or creak. The concrete was thick, well poured, not the hasty work of someone improvising. The walls were close on either side, close enough that he could touch both with his arms partially extended, but the ceiling was generous, tall enough that a man of any reasonable height would have no problem walking upright. He moved slowly, flashlight sweeping ahead and to the sides, reading the space the way he read landscape, looking for information in every surface. He reached the curve and followed it. Beyond the bend, the passage widened slightly and ended at a second door, this one interior and bearing no disguise whatsoever. It was iron, riveted, mounted on heavy hinges that had been protected from the worst of the moisture by the concrete shell around them. It was secured with a bar latch rather than a combination lock, and the bar, while stiff, turned when Marcus applied force. He pulled the second door open and stepped through. The room beyond stopped him in his tracks. It was large, much larger than the passage had suggested it would be, a rectangular chamber perhaps 50 feet long and 30 wide, with a ceiling that vaulted to a height of perhaps 15 feet. The walls were concrete block, reinforced with steel rebar visible at the corners and along regular intervals. The floor was the same formed concrete as the passage. But it was not the construction that stopped Marcus. It was the contents. The room had been a working facility. That much was immediately clear. Along one wall, metal shelving units still stood in rows, though many had tipped or collapsed, their contents scattered across the floor. He could make out the shapes of crates, some intact and some split open, spilling what appeared to be sealed metal containers of various sizes. Against the far wall, two large steel tables sat bolted to the floor, their surfaces marked by the rings and scratches of heavy use. Above them, what had once been a bank of lighting fixtures now hung dark and corroded. Filing cabinets, 4 of them, stood in a cluster near the center of the room, all of them closed but one, whose drawer had been pulled open and left hanging. Papers spilled from it, yellowed and curling, piled on the floor beneath. Marcus moved into the room carefully, his flashlight beam sweeping across the scene in slow arcs. He went first to the spilled papers, crouching to examine them without picking them up. The top sheet was covered in a dense column of numbers and abbreviated codes that he did not immediately recognize. The paper was stamped in red at the top with a phrase that made his breathing slow down. He read it twice to be sure he was reading it correctly. The stamp read, "Restricted access. Authorized personnel only. Do not reproduce." He sat back on his heels, staring at that stamp. His mind turned over what he was looking at, what it meant, where it placed him in a story that had apparently been unfolding in this canyon long before he ever arrived. He was a wilderness ranger. He had no security clearance. Whatever had been happening in this room, it had not been happening with his knowledge or the knowledge of anyone in his chain of command, as far as he knew. Or if it had been, no one had seen fit to tell him. He stood and moved toward the metal shelving units. The crates he had noticed from the doorway were, on closer inspection, stenciled with the same kinds of numeric codes that appeared on the papers. Some of the metal containers that had spilled from broken crates were sealed with wax and wire. Others had cracked open, and inside he could see the dark, desiccated forms of what appeared to be sample vials, small glass tubes and protective holders, many of them shattered, their contents dried to nothing over however many years had passed. Others contained what looked like folded documents sealed in transparent protective sleeves, the kind used for archival preservation. He did not touch any of it. He was breathing carefully now, the instinct of a man who had spent enough time in unpredictable environments to know that the act of breathing was sometimes the only thing he fully controlled. The room around him was silent in the way that deep enclosed spaces are silent, a silence that absorbed sound rather than simply lacking it, the silence of something sealed and forgotten. Whatever had taken place in this room, it had not been happening recently. The dust on every surface was thick, undisturbed except for a drift of debris near the entrance where the air currents from the passage had pushed things slightly over the years. No one had been inside this room in a very long time, but someone had built it. And someone had left it here, hidden behind a disguised iron door in a cliff face in the middle of protected wilderness land, and either forgotten about it or decided it was safer to pretend it had never existed. Marcus stood in the center of the room for a long moment, turning slowly, taking it all in. His flashlight swept across the walls, the shelving, the tables, the filing cabinets, the papers on the floor. He was keenly aware that he was alone, that no one at the ranger station knew precisely where he was, that his planned check-in time was still hours away. He was also aware that the document stamp he had read on that fallen paper was not a stamp that appeared on things of minor consequence. He made a slow circuit of the room, careful not to disturb anything, documenting everything he could with his camera. He photographed the crates, the spilled containers, the filing cabinets, the papers on the floor, the tables and their markings, the electrical conduit overhead, the reinforced corners of the walls, the door through which he had entered. He shot everything twice from different angles, moving with a deliberateness that was partly professional discipline and partly the instinct to document carefully when the thing being documented might be something he could not easily explain later. On his second circuit, he noticed something he had missed on the first pass. In the far left corner of the room, partially behind a collapsed shelving unit, was a smaller door. Not iron this time, but steel, narrower than a standard doorway, fitted with a wheel lock mechanism of the kind used in pressure-sealed environments. He worked his way around the collapsed shelving carefully, easing between it and the wall, and crouched to examine the wheel lock. Like the combination port on the outer door, time had been working on it. The wheel was stiff and corroded, but it was not fused. He wrapped both hands around it and applied slow, steady pressure. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a grinding reluctance that sent a tremor through his palms, the wheel turned. He pulled the door open. Beyond it was a smaller room, barely 10 feet square, and unlike the larger chamber, this one was not empty. A single metal chair sat in its center, bolted to the floor with the same industrial permanence that characterized everything else in the facility. The chair had restraints, thick leather straps at the armrests and the legs, dry and cracked with age, but still attached to their mountings. Facing the chair, mounted directly to the wall, was a bank of instrumentation, gauges and dials and switches, most of them corroded or broken, but enough intact to suggest their original purpose. Above the bank of instruments, a single printed card had been fixed to the wall in a metal frame. The printing had faded but was still legible in the beam of his flashlight. Marcus read it once, then read it again. His jaw tightened. He backed out of the small room and shut the steel door behind him. He walked back into the main chamber and stood beside the filing cabinets, his flashlight casting a long beam across the floor. He was thinking very clearly. He was not panicking. Marcus Hale was not a man who panicked easily, but he was aware, with a precision that matched his awareness of every trail and formation in his canyon, that he had just walked into. Something that was very far outside the boundaries of a routine patrol inspection. He needed to make a decision. He could leave now, immediately, seal the door behind him as best he could, walk back to the station, and make a full report through proper channels. That was the option that carried the least personal risk. It was the clean option, the one that put the discovery in other hands and let the protocols of larger institutions take over. It was also the option that surrendered all control over what happened next, that trusted the larger institutions to handle it correctly, and that assumed the people he reported to had clean hands in whatever this place represented. He did not move toward the door. Instead, he pulled on a pair of work gloves from his pack and opened the hanging drawer of the filing cabinet. He reached inside and withdrew a folder from near the top of the pile, handling it carefully at the edges. He set it on the flat surface of the nearest steel table and opened it under his flashlight. What he saw inside made the cold in the room feel deeper. The folder contained a series of typed documents, formal in their language, bearing letterhead from a federal agency designation that he did not immediately recognize, an acronym that matched nothing in his experience. The documents were dated. The oldest ones were from decades earlier, well before Marcus had been born. The most recent ones bore dates from slightly more than 30 years ago. They were addressed to individuals identified only by designation numbers, never by name. And they described, in the precise and bloodless language of bureaucratic authority, a program of research and containment that had operated in this location for a period of at least 11 years. He turned pages slowly. His gloved fingers moved carefully, not disturbing the order of the documents, just turning them over one at a time. The language was dense and technical in places, but the outline of what it described was not difficult to follow if you read it patiently and with an eye for what the careful phrasing was trying not to say directly. There had been test subjects. The documents referred to them as participants, but the context made the actual word clear enough. There had been medical procedures conducted in this facility. There had been data collected, logged, transmitted through some chain of command to some receiving authority who was never identified in the documents themselves. And there had been deaths. Not accidental deaths, not complications from illness or misadventure, but death that the documents characterized with a phrase that Marcus read 3 times before he allowed himself to understand what it meant. The phrase was discontinued participation. He closed the folder and set it back in the cabinet drawer exactly as he had found it. He pulled off his gloves and pressed the heels of both hands against the edge of the table, leaning on them, staring at the floor. The dust on the concrete between his boots was thick and gray and perfectly undisturbed. Outside the sealed door, somewhere above the cliff face and the canyon wall and the open desert sky, the ravens had presumably returned to their perch on the eastern ridge. The wind was moving. The sage was dry and silver in the October light. The world outside this room was operating with the complete indifference of the natural world, turning over its cycles without reference to anything human beings had done in the dark spaces they carved into it. Marcus breathed in, breathed out. He was not going to leave. Not yet. He was going to understand what he had found before he decided what to do with it. That was the only approach that made sense. That was the only approach that honored the weight of what these documents were describing. He reached back into his pack and pulled out his small notebook, the one he used for trail observations and wildlife notes, and he began to write. Dates, designations, phrases, the details that his memory might blur or conflate if he let too much time pass before recording them. He wrote for 20 minutes without stopping. When he finished, he walked the room again, this time more slowly, looking at it not as a scene to document photographically, but as a space to understand. He tried to imagine it as it had been, lit and functional, people moving through it, the instruments on the walls active, the crates sealed and organized on the shelving units, the tables in use. He tried to imagine what it meant to work in a place like this and what it meant to be brought to a place like this against your will. Both imaginations were equally difficult. Both carried a weight that pressed on him in the sealed silence of the chamber. He turned his flashlight toward the entrance passage and then stopped again, because he had just noticed something he had not noticed before. On the wall beside the interior door, at approximately shoulder height, barely visible beneath a thick layer of dust, was writing. Not printed text, not a typed document or a stamped designation. Handwriting, scratched directly into the concrete with something sharp. He stepped close and brought his flashlight up to angle the beam across the surface so that the shallow scratches cast shadows and became legible. The writing was in 2 parts. The first part was a single word, and he read it, and it hit him the way very simple things sometimes hit with more force than complicated ones. The word was, remember. Below it, scratched in the same hand but in smaller letters, as though the person had less space or less time or less strength when they wrote the second part, were 2 lines that Marcus read and then stood staring at for a long time. The lines read, they called this progress. We called it by our names. He did not write these lines in his notebook. He did not need to. They had already written themselves somewhere that notebooks could not reach. Marcus stepped back from the wall. He looked at the room one more time. The collapsed shelving, the scattered crates, the filing cabinets, the table bolted to the floor, the passage leading back toward a door that had been hidden in a canyon wall for longer than he had been alive. All of it silent. All of it waiting. He picked up his pack, adjusted the straps, and walked back through the passage to the entrance. He pulled the outer door shut behind him with both hands, easing it into its frame as carefully as he could. The seam closed with a sound like something exhaling. The disguised surface faced outward again, stone-colored and plain, invisible to every eye that did not already know what it was. Marcus stood in the shadow of the canyon wall and looked at that section of cliff face for a long moment. He could see it now, the seam, the rectangle of it, the slight difference in texture where the coating over the iron had aged at a rate infinitesimally different from the sandstone around it. He could see it because he knew it was there. From 20 feet away, from any angle other than the one he now occupied, it would have vanished completely into the rock. He turned and started walking back toward the station. His boots crunched on the gravel of the canyon floor. High above, on the eastern ridge, the ravens circled in the pewter sky. He did not reach for his radio. Not yet. He needed to think. He needed to understand what he was carrying and what it meant and what it was going to cost him to carry it any further. He walked for a long time before he stopped thinking about the words on the wall. He was not sure he ever fully stopped. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything, and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The walk back to the station took longer than the walk out. Not because Marcus walked slowly. He walked at the same steady pace he always kept, the pace that had covered thousands of miles of this terrain over the years without rushing and without flagging. But the distance felt different when you were carrying something. Not a physical weight, though his pack had not changed. A different kind of weight, the kind that sits behind the sternum and makes the familiar shapes of the landscape look slightly altered, as though the light hitting the canyon walls has shifted by a degree so small you cannot name it, but cannot stop noticing. He reached the first section of dry wash and followed it east, the way he had come that morning. The ravens had gone somewhere. The sky above the canyon rim was the pale, featureless gray that preceded overcast. The weather system Priya had mentioned moving in from the northwest on schedule. The air had the particular stillness that came before weather changed, everything holding its breath. Marcus walked, and he thought, and what he thought circled back repeatedly to two things. The first was the documents in the filing cabinet. The second was the words on the wall. The documents had described, in the language of federal bureaucracy at its most impersonal, a program that had run in that hidden chamber for more than a decade. They had used words like research protocol and containment procedures and discontinued participation. They had assigned numbers to human beings and logged their bodies' responses to things that were never named directly in the text, only referenced by alphanumeric codes. They had noted deaths without attributing cause. They had been written by people who understood that certain things were safer to describe obliquely, that a word like discontinued was preferable to a word like killed, not because the meaning was different, but because the paper trail mattered more than honesty. He had read enough in those pages to understand the shape of what had happened there. He had not read enough to know all the details, and he was not certain the details would change the shape. Certain shapes were recognizable without every detail filled in. The words on the wall were different. They did not have the shape of bureaucracy. They had the shape of a human being in a moment of diminishment, scratching the only resistance available to them into a surface that might outlast everything else. Remember, the word sat in his chest like a stone, and the second part, the two lines below it, carried a precision of grief that he did not know how to set aside. They called this progress. We called it by our names. Whoever had written that had understood, in whatever time and circumstances they had available, that the greatest violence done to them was not physical. It was the removal of personhood, the replacement of a name with a number, the replacement of a life with a data point. And they had scratched that understanding into concrete with whatever they had, a nail, a piece of wire, the edge of a metal fixture, something sharp enough to leave a mark on the hardest surface available, because the alternative was to leave nothing at all. Marcus came up out of the dry wash onto a flat section of trail and paused. He looked back toward the canyon behind him, though he could no longer see the section of wall he had been standing at that morning. He reached into his pack and pulled out his water bottle, drank without tasting, put it back. He was sweating despite the cooling air. He had been sweating since he walked out of that facility, he realized, and had not thought to drink until now. He needed to make a decision. He had known since the moment he stepped back out into the canyon that he needed to make a decision, and he had been giving himself the walk home to make it. The walk was nearly over, and the decision was still sitting on the edge of being made, balanced there with a kind of precarious patience that would not hold much longer. His options were not complicated in their structure. They were only complicated in their consequences. He could report what he had found through normal channels. His immediate supervisor at the district level was a man named Calloway, competent and generally fair, with 20 years of service and a clear understanding of protocol. Calloway would know how to route a report of this nature, or would know who to ask. The report would go up through the chain, would eventually reach people with the authority and the institutional resources to investigate a sealed federal facility of undetermined origin and purpose. That was the function of the system. That was what it was for. But Marcus had been in this work long enough to understand something that younger rangers sometimes took years to learn, if they learned it at all. Systems are composed of people. The chain of command is composed of people. And people who occupy positions of authority in chains of command sometimes have histories, relationships, and interests that run parallel to their official function in ways that are not visible from outside. A report of this facility, routed upward through channels, would eventually reach people with the institutional authority to do something about it. It would also, by definition, reach people with the institutional authority to make sure nothing was done about it. The question of which outcome occurred would depend entirely on who those people were, and Marcus had no way of knowing who those people were from where he stood. He also did not know who else knew this facility existed. If it had been built by a federal agency, some record of it existed somewhere, even if deeply buried. Someone, somewhere, had signed off on the construction, had approved the budget, had overseen the program. Those people had, in the intervening decades, either died or moved on or continued operating in some capacity within the structures of government and institutional life. The possibility that reporting this discovery would reach one of those people before it reached anyone who could act with integrity was not a paranoid fantasy. It was a reasonable assessment of risk based on the evidence available to him. He started walking again. There was a second option. He could contact someone outside the normal chain. A journalist, a legal organization, an advocacy group, someone who would treat this not as an administrative matter to be routed correctly, but as a story that the public had a legitimate claim to know. That option had its own risks. It meant going around the chain of command, which was not something his 17 years of service had ever required him to do. It meant exposing himself to the accusation of insubordination or worse, of having improperly accessed and disclosed restricted information. And it meant trusting that the journalist or legal organization or advocacy group he chose would be effective in a situation where the opposition would have institutional resources and likely decades of practice in making things disappear. He thought about the documents he had photographed. He thought about the notebook in his pack with the dates and designations he had copied down. He thought about the sealed vials on the floor of that chamber, their contents dried to nothing over however many years had passed, and about what those contents might have represented to the people who had been designated as participants in whatever had been cataloged in those files. He thought about the chair with the restraints, bolted to the floor of that inner room. He thought about the card on the wall above the bank of instruments. He had not written down what the card said. He had only read it, but he remembered it completely. He would continue to remember it for the rest of his life. He already knew, the same way he would always be able to recall the exact quality of the light in that chamber and the smell of the air that had come through the door when he first pulled it open. The card had read, "Subject comfort is not a primary concern of this program. Efficiency of data collection is the primary concern." Someone had framed that. Someone had printed it and put it in a frame and mounted it on the wall of a room where a chair with restraints was bolted to the floor. Not as a warning, not as a reminder to do better, as a statement of values, as an operating principle that they had decided was worth committing to a permanent display. Marcus stopped walking. He was at the top of the last ridge before the descent toward the station. He stood on the red rock surface and looked out across his sector, the canyon walls and the mesas, and the distant line of the mountains to the north going gray under the approaching overcast. He had stood on this ridge thousands of times. He knew every visible formation from this angle, could name them, could describe their geology and their position relative to every other landmark in view. He had believed, for 17 years, that he understood what this place was, that he had learned it completely enough to be its guardian. He understood now that there was a version of this canyon that had existed in the dark, literally in the dark, while he walked above it, while he filed his reports and photographed his mountain lion tracks, and drank his coffee in the early morning and believed he knew where he was. The thing about hidden places was not only that they contained what they contained. It was that they changed the meaning of the surface above them. The canyon he stood in was not quite the canyon he had thought it was. It had a room in it that he had not known about, and that room had contained people, and those people had left marks in concrete that were still there, and the agency that had put them there had referred to their deaths as discontinued participation. He reached for his radio. He held it in his hand without keying it. Stood there for another full minute in the rising wind. Then he put it back. He descended the ridge toward the station. He had 3 miles left to walk, and he was going to use them well. The station was a modest structure by any measure, a single-story building of cinder block and timber that sat at the end of a dirt track barely wide enough for the government-issue pickup Marcus used for supply runs and the occasional patrol route where the terrain allowed a vehicle. It had 2 rooms inside, an office and a bunk room, with a small bathroom attached. The office held a radio setup, a filing cabinet of his own, a topographic map of the sector pinned to the wall with colored markers indicating trails, known wildlife movement corridors, water sources, and points of interest. There was a desk, a chair, a propane heater that worked reliably in all but the coldest months, and a shelf holding the logbooks that Marcus kept with meticulous care. The bunk room held a cot, a footlocker, and a small window that faced west so the evening light came in at the end of the day in long, warm bars that Marcus had, over many years, come to regard as the best part of a quiet evening. He pushed the door open and dropped his pack on the floor beside the desk. He was tired in a way that went below muscle and bone. He filled a tin cup with water from the tank beside the door and drank it standing up, then filled it again and set it on the desk. He sat down heavily in the chair and looked at the topographic map on the wall, finding the canyon section almost immediately, running his eye along the northern arm of it to the spot where the cliff face would be. There was nothing marked there. No symbol, no note, no designation of any kind. The map showed rock and contour lines and nothing else. Whatever had been built into that cliff face had been built without leaving a trace on any document that Marcus had ever been given access to. He pulled his notebook from his pack and opened it on the desk. He looked at what he had written in the chamber, the dates, the designations, the phrases he had copied from the documents in the filing cabinet. He read through it twice, slowly, checking each item against his memory of the documents themselves. His memory was good. The notebook matched what he had seen. The notebook was now, as far as he knew, the only record of those details that existed outside of that sealed room, and whatever buried institutional archive might still hold a copy of the program's operational records. He thought about that. He thought about who held those archives, and whether those people knew what they were holding, and whether they had ever been compelled to look at it honestly. His radio crackled. The check-in call from Priya, right on schedule. He keyed it. He confirmed his position. He said the patrol had been routine. He said he was back at the station and would file his log in the morning. Priya signed off cheerfully, the sound of her voice carrying the casual normalcy of someone whose day had not contained anything like what his had contained, and Marcus set the radio back in its mount and sat in the silence of his office for a long time. He thought about the chair with the restraints. He thought about the card on the wall. He thought about discontinued participation. At some point, he became aware that the light outside had changed. The overcast had thickened during his walk home, and now the late afternoon light was flat and gray, pressing against the small window of his office without much conviction. He had been sitting at the desk long enough that the water in his tin cup had gone cold. He drank it anyway. He made a decision. It was not a dramatic moment. It did not feel like a turning point in the way that turning points felt in stories. It felt like the natural conclusion of a long and careful consideration, the way a trail decision feels when you have been reading the terrain for long enough to know which way the ground goes. He was not going to report this through normal channels. Not first. Not until he had more. He was going to go back to that facility. He was going to spend as much time as he needed going through those files. He was going to understand, as completely as he could, what had happened in that room before he made any move that might accelerate the process of it disappearing again. He did not make this decision lightly. He was aware that it meant withholding information from his chain of command. He was aware that it put him in a position of personal and professional risk that his 17 years of clean service had never approached. He was also aware that the people whose names, or at least whose numbers, were in those filing cabinet folders deserved something better than a process that had already demonstrated, over decades, its capacity for making them disappear. He owed them more than a routine report. He opened his logbook and wrote the day's entry. He described the routine of the morning patrol, the mountain lion track, the weather observation, the return to the station. He described nothing else. He closed the logbook and set it on the shelf beside the others. Then he took his notebook, the one with the copied details from the chamber, and locked it in his footlocker in the bunk room. He heated a can of beans on the propane stove and ate, without tasting, and went to bed before full dark. He did not sleep well. The chair in the inner room visited him in the spaces between sleep and waking, and the words on the wall repeated themselves in various arrangements. And once, in a half-dream that was more feeling than image, he was standing in the chamber again, and the flashlight in his hand was dying, the beam narrowing and reddening as the battery faded, and he could feel the room getting larger as the light got smaller, the walls retreating into a dark that was absolute and complete. And he understood in the way of dreams that the darkness was not just the absence of light, but the condition of everything that had happened there. that the darkness was the whole truth of it, and the only thing he could do was stand in the center of it and refuse to look away. He woke before the alarm. The sky outside his window was still black, the stars visible through a gap in the cloud cover that had moved through in the night. He made coffee. He sat outside in the cold with the tin cup warming his hands and watched the sky and thought about what he was going to do. He was going back today. He was going back with more time and more supplies and a clearer plan for what he needed to find. He needed to understand the scope of the program, the number of people involved, the duration, the chain of authorization. He needed names, if names existed anywhere in those files. The documents he had looked at the day before had been careful to avoid names, but careful bureaucracies sometimes slipped. A personal note tucked into a folder, a handwritten annotation on a typed page, a signature that a subordinate had omitted to redact. 17 years of reading landscape had taught him that even the most deliberately featureless surface left traces if you looked at it long enough and from the right angle. He packed his bag differently this time. More water, a headlamp in addition to his flashlight, and spare batteries for both. A full set of nitrile gloves from the first aid kit, thinner and more precise than his work gloves. A larger notebook, his personal camera rather than the government-issue one, so that whatever images he produced would not be stored on a device that belonged to the agency. A small voice recorder. He thought about all of this as he assembled it, conscious of each decision and what it signified. He left the station before dawn, moving through the dark with his headlamp on a low setting, navigating the dry wash by memory more than light. The canyon was cold and very still. The stars above the canyon rim were hard and clear in the spaces between the moving cloud cover. An owl called somewhere ahead of him and fell silent. He reached the northern arm of the canyon as the sky was beginning to lighten, the horizon above the eastern rim going from black to deep blue. He found the section of wall without difficulty. In the growing light, knowing what he was looking at, the seam of the door was more visible than it had been the day before, or perhaps he was simply seeing it now with different eyes. He worked it open again, the hinges grinding in protest, and stepped through into the passage. The air inside was the same, cool, enclosed, bearing that faint suggestion of human occupation preserved in amber. He switched on the headlamp and moved through the passage to the interior door, worked the bar latch, and stepped into the main chamber. He had worried, during the night, that coming back would feel different, that the reality of the place would diminish somehow in the return, the way that shocking things sometimes seem less absolute on second exposure. It did not feel different. If anything, it felt more real than it had the first time, the way a diagnosis feels more real at the second appointment than it did in the first shock of hearing it. He went directly to the filing cabinets. He worked methodically and without rushing. He pulled each drawer in turn and examined its contents carefully before removing anything, looking first at how the files were organized, what system had been used. The cabinets had been numbered, 1 through 4, and within each cabinet the folders were arranged by alphanumeric designation. The numbering system was not immediately intuitive, but after working through the first cabinet carefully, Marcus began to understand its logic. The first component of each designation appeared to refer to a time period. The second component appeared to refer to a category of record. The third component was specific to an individual subject. He photographed everything in systematic sequence. He did not rush. He was methodical and patient in the way of a man who had spent years learning that patience was the difference between understanding a place and merely passing through it. In the second cabinet, in a folder that was slightly thicker than the others around it, he found something the day before's brief examination had not turned up. Between 2 typed documents, folded in half and then in half again, was a handwritten letter. Not a note, not a fragment. A letter, 3 full pages in a small and careful hand, written on paper that had once been white and was now the pale amber of old documents. He unfolded it with gloved hands and read it under the beam of his headlamp. The letter had no salutation. It did not begin with a name or a dear anyone. It began in the middle of a thought, as though the writer had been carrying on a conversation with themselves for so long that the formality of an opening had become unnecessary. The handwriting was precise but increasingly unsteady as the pages progressed, the letters tightening and the lines losing their evenness in the way that happens when someone writes under strain for a long time and the strain wins eventually over the discipline. Marcus read it straight through without stopping. The writer had been a doctor. He identified himself only as the program's primary medical officer, which matched the framing of the official documents in the same cabinet, where the primary medical officer was referred to by a designation number. He had come to this facility, the letter explained, believing in the legitimacy of the program, believing that the research being conducted served a genuine national interest and that the people designated as participants had, in some formal or quasi-formal sense, consented to their participation. He had believed this because he had been told this, and because he had wanted to believe it, and because, in the beginning, the evidence available to him had not contradicted it clearly enough to force a reckoning. He had continued believing it for longer than was defensible, the letter admitted. He named a specific incident, described in enough detail that Marcus could identify the corresponding folder in the cabinet drawer without looking. A participant whose records showed a clean bill of health on every relevant measure, but who had nonetheless remained in the program for an additional 14 months after those records were filed. During those 14 months, the participant had experienced what the official records characterized as significant physical decline of indeterminate cause. What the letter described, in the primary medical officer's own words, was a man in his 30s who had been healthy when he arrived and who had died in the inner room of this facility because no one with the authority to release him had chosen to do so. The letter did not attempt to excuse the writer's role in this. It described, instead, with a clarity that cost something to read, the precise moment when the writer had understood that his belief in the program's legitimacy was not a belief that the facts supported but a decision he had been making, actively, every day, to interpret the available evidence in a way that allowed him to continue. He wrote about the difference between being deceived and choosing not to look. He wrote about both with equal honesty. He had written this letter, he said in the final page, because he had become convinced that the program was going to end, and that when it ended, the files in this facility would be sealed, and the people who had passed through it would cease to exist in any official record. He wanted there to be something in those files that was not official. He wanted there to be something that spoke in a human voice rather than the language of designation numbers and discontinued participation. He wanted someone, at some future point, to open a cabinet in this room and find among the bureaucratic language one document that had not been written by the bureaucracy. He signed it with his actual name. Marcus photographed the letter. He photographed each page separately, with the headlamp angle adjusted to ensure the handwriting was fully legible. He refolded exactly as he had found it and replaced it in the folder between the same two typed documents. He closed the folder and set it back in the cabinet drawer in its correct position. He sat back on his heels on the concrete floor of the chamber and let out a slow breath. He was aware of a feeling in his chest that was difficult to name precisely. It was not grief exactly, though it carried some of the weight of grief. It was something more like the feeling of suddenly understanding the full dimensions of a space you thought you already knew, the recognition that there was more here than the shape you had originally perceived, and that the more changed everything about how you understood the shape. He got up and continued working. He went through the remaining cabinets with the same care. He found more typed documents, more designation numbers, more of the precise and bloodless language of official record-keeping. He found a logbook, separate from the files, that appeared to have tracked the operational status of the facility on a day-by-day basis, noting power levels, supply inventories, personnel counts, and what it called participant status updates, which were recorded in a simple coded notation that Marcus spent 40 minutes working out before he was confident he understood it. The codes indicated 3 possible states: active, inactive, discontinued. The logbook covered a span of 11 years. The final entries were terse and uninformative, recording only facility status and nothing about participants, as though by the end the personnel had stopped keeping detailed records of what was happening to the people in their care. The last entry in the logbook was a single line: facility suspended pending review. No review date recorded. No review had apparently ever come. By late morning, Marcus had worked through everything in the filing cabinets that was accessible without more specialized knowledge or equipment. He had a full photographic record and extensive handwritten notes. He had the name from the letter, the name the primary medical officer had signed at the bottom of his 3 pages of honest accounting. He had dates spanning 11 years and a documentary picture of a program that had operated in a sealed concrete chamber built into the wall of a protected wilderness canyon. funded by a federal designation that no longer appeared in any current agency listing he was aware of, conducting research on human participants who had been characterized in the program's own records as resources rather than people. He stood in the center of the chamber and looked at the room one more time. He needed to make the next decision now. He had the documentation. He had the evidence. The question was no longer whether to act on it. The question was how, and in what sequence, and with whom. He thought about the doctor's letter. He thought about the names signed at the bottom of it. If that man was still alive, he would be very old. If he had left other records, kept copies of documents outside this facility, spoken to anyone in the intervening decades, there might be a thread to pull. The name was a starting point of a kind that pure institutional records rarely provided. He thought about the scratched words on the wall. They called this progress. We called it by our names. The participants had been stripped of their names within the official record. They existed in the filing cabinets as numbers. But they had existed in the world as people with names, with families, with histories outside this room. Somewhere, those histories still existed, in the memories of people who had loved them and waited for them, and eventually been told something, or nothing, and been left to make sense of an absence that was never explained. Those people deserved to know. Marcus walked to the wall where the handwriting was and stood in front of it for a long time. He photographed it. He did not need to. He already had it memorized. But he photographed it because it was evidence, and because evidence needed to be documented completely, and because whoever had written it had intended it to be found and read and remembered, and he was not going to treat it as anything less than exactly that. He picked up his pack. He walked back through the passage and out through the iron door and pulled it shut behind him and stood in the canyon light. The cloud cover had thinned overnight, and the morning was bright, the red rock walls of the canyon vivid in the October sunlight. He stood there breathing the open air for a moment, feeling the difference between it and the air inside the chamber, the difference between space that the sky touched and space that had been sealed from the sky for decades. Then he started moving. Not back toward the station. Not yet. He moved south along the base of the canyon wall, his eyes on the terrain, his mind working through the question of next steps with the same methodical patience he had applied to the filing cabinets. He needed to contact someone outside the agency. He had been thinking about this since the previous evening, and he had arrived at a specific kind of someone. Not a journalist, not yet, though that would come. First, he needed someone who could assess the legal and institutional dimensions of what he had found, someone who could tell him what obligations he had, what protections existed for a person in his position, and what the most effective path to accountability looked like from the standpoint of someone who had done this kind of work before. He knew of a legal organization, a nonprofit that focused specifically on governmental accountability and the rights of people harmed by institutional programs. He had read about them years ago in a context he now struggled to remember precisely, but the name had stayed with him the way names sometimes did when you filed them away against some future need. He did not know if they were the right organization for this specific situation. He did not know enough yet to be confident of that. But they were a starting point outside the chain of command, and right now a starting point outside the chain of command was what he needed. He would need to contact them carefully, from outside the station, not on any government-issue device, not in a way that created a traceable record linking this contact to his official capacity. These were not the precautions of a paranoid man. They were the precautions of a man who had read a letter written by a doctor who had once believed in the legitimacy of the program he was part of, and who had come to understand, too late for the people in his care, that belief in legitimacy was not the same as legitimacy itself. Marcus walked south along the canyon floor and thought about all the mornings he had walked this ground without knowing. He thought about the times he had stood at the top of the ridge above this section of the canyon and looked out over his sector and believed he understood where he was. He had understood the surface of it. He had understood the geology and the ecology and the seasonal patterns and the wildlife corridors. He had understood the canyon in the ways that 17 years of careful observation allowed a person to understand a place. He had not understood what was inside it. He was not sure how to hold that. He was not sure it could be resolved in any clean way. The knowledge that the place you had dedicated yourself to protecting had contained something you had not protected anyone from because you had not known it was there. The people in those folders had been in this canyon while Marcus was walking above them. Not at the same time. The dates suggested the program had ended before he arrived in this sector, but in the canyon, in the rock. In the space he considered his responsibility, he stopped walking. He was at a section of the canyon floor where a natural alcove in the wall created a patch of shade and a flat surface of stone worn smooth by the passage of water in wetter seasons. He sat down on the stone and put his pack beside him and looked at the canyon walls rising on either side. He had a name. He had documentation. He had a plan for his next step. What he did not yet have was a clear understanding of how large this was, and that uncertainty pressed on him in the way that incomplete information always pressed on him in the field, the sense of navigating by a map that he knew was missing significant features. How many programs like this one had existed? Not in this canyon specifically. In the country. In the network of federal agencies and sub-agencies and programs that had operated under the same kind of authorization as this one. The kind of authorization that rested on the premise that some research was too important to be constrained by the ordinary protections extended to ordinary people, and that some locations were too remote for ordinary oversight to reach, and that some periods of history were exceptional enough to justify exceptional measures that would later be sealed behind iron doors and painted over to match the surrounding stone. He did not know the answer to that. It was possible no one did with full precision. It was the kind of knowledge that lived in fragments, in sealed archives, in the memories of very old people who had signed agreements that made speaking difficult, in the files of organizations that had been trying to pull those fragments together for decades and had achieved some measure of success and a great deal of obstruction. He was now in possession of one of those fragments. A significant one, he believed, though he was cautious about his own assessment of its significance. The people who had been here would have a better sense of its significance than he did. The families of those people, if they could be found, would have the most accurate sense of it. He got up and kept walking. By the time he reached a section of trail that brought him close enough to the canyon rim to get a signal, the afternoon light was tilting west. He had been in the canyon for most of the day. He pulled out his personal phone, a device he rarely used in the field, and checked for reception. 2 bars. He opened a browser and searched for the organization he had been thinking of. He found them. He found a contact form and a phone number and a brief description of their work that confirmed they handled exactly this category of case. He looked at the phone number for a long time. He did not call from here. Not from a location that his government radio had been reporting as his patrol sector for the last 2 days. He would drive out to the nearest town on his next off day, which was 4 days away, and he would call from there. From a payphone if one still existed, or from a phone purchased for the purpose, and he would tell them what he had found in the most precise and complete terms he could manage, and he would let them assess whether it was what he believed it was. For days. He would go back to the facility once more before then, to make sure he had not missed anything significant. He would spend those 4 days at the station, going through his normal routines without deviation, filing his logs, making his check-in calls, doing the work of being a wilderness ranger in the way that he always did it. He would not look different. He would not act different. He was not a man who showed his interior life easily, and this was not a moment to start. He descended back into the canyon and began the walk back to the station. That evening he made his coffee and sat outside in the cooling air and watched the stars appear above the canyon rim and thought about the doctor who had signed his name. He had searched the name on his personal phone that afternoon and found very little. A brief professional record that ended abruptly at a date consistent with the facility's apparent closure. No subsequent publications, no affiliated institutions, no current address. The man would be in his late 80s or early 90s if he was still alive. He might not be, but his family might be. His name was specific enough to search, and a name attached to a letter was more than most records of this kind ever provided. Marcus went inside. He heated water for tea and sat at his desk, and opened his personal notebook to a clean page and wrote down everything he planned to do in the next 4 days. The list was short. The plan was clear. He had been in situations where the path forward was visible and the distance to cover was significant, and that was what this was. Visible path. Significant distance. He closed the notebook. He went to bed. He slept better than the previous night. Not well, but better. The half-dream of the chamber came once. But this time when the flashlight beam narrowed in his dream, he reached into his pack and pulled out the spare batteries and changed them in the dark. And the light came back strong and full, and the room was exactly the size it was, no larger, and he stood in the center of it with the beam pointed at the words on the wall. Remember. He woke with that word sitting clearly in his mind. not as a haunting, but as an instruction, as a task that had been assigned to him by someone who had written it into concrete with whatever they had that was sharp enough to leave a mark, and had trusted that eventually someone would come who could carry it further than the walls of that room. He rose. He made coffee. He put on his boots. He went out into the morning and began the day. The routine continued for 3 more days. Marcus walked his sector. He checked his trail markers. He documented the weather changes that came with the deepening autumn, the way the light hit the canyon walls at a lower angle each morning, the first frost that appeared on the flat stones at the canyon floor 2 mornings after he found the door. He made his check-in calls. He filed his logs. He ate his simple meals and slept his complicated nights and went back over his notes in the evenings, refining his account of what he had seen and what he understood it to mean. On the second of the 3 days, he went back to the facility. He spent 4 hours inside, going through sections he had not fully examined on his first 2 visits. He found, in a storage area behind the collapsed shelving on the far wall, a series of sealed metal boxes that he had initially taken for equipment housings. On closer examination, they were not equipment housings. They were personal effects boxes, the kind used by institutions to store the belongings of people who could not be given them back immediately. Each box was labeled with a designation number. Each box, when he opened it with a flat tool from his pack, contained the small inventory of objects that a person carried with them when they were taken from their ordinary life. A wallet, its contents dried and cracked but still present. A watch with a broken face. A ring. A photograph in a small frame, the image faded to near invisibility but the frame itself intact, the kind of thing a person keeps on a bedside table. Letters, folded small, the ink gone to ghost. Marcus did not remove anything from the boxes. He photographed each one. He documented each designation number. He replaced the lids and left the boxes exactly as he had found them. He had been wrong, he realized, to think the files were the most important thing in this room. The files were the record of what had happened. The boxes were the evidence that the people to whom it had happened had been real. Not participants. Not subjects. Not designation numbers. People who had carried photographs in small frames and folded letters from the people they loved and watches that had stopped at a particular moment that was now lost to history. He closed the storage area and walked back through the chamber to the entrance passage. Standing at the interior door before he pulled it shut, he looked back at the room one last time. The headlamps swept the shelving, the cabinets, the scattered papers, the bolted tables. The corridor to the inner room where the chair waited in the dark. He thought about the letter. He thought about the boxes. He thought about the words on the wall. He thought about what it would mean to bring this into the light. It would be complicated. It would be resisted. There would be institutions with significant resources and significant motivation to characterize what he had found in ways that minimized its meaning or disputed its provenance or buried it in procedural argument until the people who cared about it lost energy or died. That was not a cynical prediction. That was a pattern with historical precedent clear enough to be relied upon. But the doctor had signed his name, and whoever had scratched those words into the concrete had trusted that someone would eventually stand in this room and read them. And the people in the boxes had been real, and their families were still out there somewhere, having lived for decades with an absence they had never been given the truth of. The weight of what he was carrying was significant. He was aware of it in a way that was physical, present in the set of his shoulders and the quality of his breathing, not heavy enough to stop him, but heavy enough to feel every step. He pulled the interior door shut. He walked the passage. He pulled the outer door closed and stood in the canyon light and breathed. For days after finding the door, Marcus drove out of his sector in the government pickup on the pretext of a supply run. He drove 2 hours to a town large enough to have a hardware store and a diner and a row of older-style payphones outside the bus station that had somehow survived the decades when everything similar had been removed. He parked down the street. He walked to the payphones. He dialed the number he had written in his personal notebook. A woman answered on the third ring. He told her who he was. He told her he was a federal wilderness ranger with 17 years of service in good standing. He told her he had found something in his sector that he believed required the involvement of an organization equipped to handle it with integrity and competence, and without routing it immediately back into the institutional channels that had originally produced it. He told her that he was calling from a payphone in a town 2 hours from his station, and that he had been careful to use no government-issued device or communication channel for this call. There was a pause on the other end of the line, not a long one. Then the woman asked him to describe, in general terms, the nature of what he had found. He described it in general terms. He described the door, the chamber, the filing cabinets, the documentation, the chair, the words on the wall. There was another pause. Then she asked him a question that told him, with considerable precision, that she understood the landscape of what he was describing, that she had navigated this terrain before and knew its specific geography. The question was, "Do you have documentation you have not shared with your chain of command?" "Yes," he said. She asked if he could come to their office. She said they were not close, that it would require travel. She said they would cover his expenses if that was an obstacle. She said they would handle everything he brought them with the full resources of their organization, and that they had significant experience with exactly this category of case and significant relationships with journalists and legal authorities who could be trusted to handle it in a way that served the people to whom it had happened. He said he could come. He said he needed 2 weeks to arrange coverage for his sector without raising questions. She said 2 weeks was fine. She said they had been waiting for something like this for a very long time. She did not say it dramatically. She said it the way a person says a plain thing that is simply true. He hung up the payphone and stood on the sidewalk outside the bus station in a town 2 hours from his canyon. And for the first time since he had pulled that iron door open and smelled the air of the chamber beyond it, he felt something other than the weight of what he was carrying. It was small, whatever the feeling was. Tentative. The kind of thing you do not name immediately because naming it feels like a presumption. But it was there. He walked back to the pickup and drove back toward his sector and thought about all the things that were about to change, and all the things that were not going to change easily, and all the reasons that what he was doing was right regardless of how difficult it became. The canyon waited for him as it always did, indifferent and ancient, and full of the silence it had been keeping for longer than anyone had been there to hear it. He drove into it as the sun went down behind the western mesas, the light going red, and then amber, and then the particular pale gold that appeared only in the last few minutes before dark, and the canyon walls held that color for a moment, brief and complete, before the dark came and took it. Marcus parked at the station. He got out of the truck. He stood in the cold night air for a moment and looked up at the stars above the canyon rim. He thought about a room in a cliff face full of boxes and files, and a chair with restraints and words scratched into concrete by someone who had trusted that eventually the walls would not be enough to keep the truth inside them. He went inside. He made coffee. He sat at his desk and opened his notebook and began to write the full account, everything, from the beginning, in the most precise and complete terms he could manage. The 2 weeks before Marcus left his sector passed the way time passes when every day carries a private weight that cannot be shared with anyone around you. He went about his work with the same deliberateness he always had, walking his trails, checking his markers, filing his logs, making his radio calls at the scheduled times. He was present in all the ways that mattered for the job and absent in the way that mattered for everything else, his mind running its own parallel route through terrain that had no map and no seasonal pattern and no markers that anyone else could read. He went back to the facility one final time, for days before his scheduled departure. He did not go to gather more documentation. He had everything he needed. He went because something in him required it, the same instinct that made him return to a section of trail after a significant storm, not to repair it, but simply to see it, to stand in the presence of it, and let it be real in the way that only physical presence makes things real. He pulled the iron door open in the early morning light and stepped inside, and walked the passage and stood in the chamber for a long time without his flashlight, letting his eyes adjust to the almost dark, the faint ambient light that filtered through the passage from outside barely enough to give the space its shapes. He stood there for perhaps 20 minutes. He did not look at anything in particular. He let the room be what it was around him. Let it occupy its full dimensions in the darkness. Let it have the weight it had earned through everything that had happened in it. He was not a religious man in any conventional sense. He did not pray. But standing in that chamber in the near dark felt like something adjacent to what prayer was supposed to do. The act of being fully present to something larger and more terrible than yourself, without flinching and without retreating into the comfort of language or explanation. When he left, he pulled the door shut carefully behind him. He stood outside in the morning air and looked at the cliff face, at the disguised surface of the door, at the seam that was visible to him now and would always be visible to him now. no matter how long he lived. He pressed his palm flat against the cold iron surface for a moment. Then he turned and walked back to the station. He drove out of his sector on a Friday morning. He had arranged for a seasonal ranger named Delgado to cover his patrol routes for the week, giving a reason that was partial truth and partial misdirection, family matters, which was not entirely a lie. What he was about to do was, in the deepest sense, a family matter. A matter of accountability to people who had been in this canyon, who had been in this country, who had been treated by the institutions of this country in a way that deserved reckoning, and who had no surviving advocates in any official sense except the accident of a ranger who had pressed his fingers against a cliff face and found iron where there should have been stone. He drove for most of the day. The landscape changed as he drove, the red rock desert giving way to lower elevation scrubland, and then to the broader flatness of a different kind of country, and then to the gradual accumulation of infrastructure that preceded a city. He had booked a motel room under his own name, because there was no reason not to, because he was not a fugitive and had committed no crime, and because the paranoia that would have had him register under a false name was exactly the kind of thinking that he needed to resist. He was a man who had found something true and was taking it to people equipped to act on it. That was all. The act of treating it as more furtive than that would have been a kind of capitulation to the instinct to be smaller than the situation required. He checked in and showered and ate at a diner 3 blocks from the motel and went to bed at 9 and slept, genuinely slept, for the first time in 2 weeks with something approaching fullness. The dream of the chamber did not come. What came instead was a dream of the canyon in good morning light, the ravens on the ridge, the smell of sage, the sound of his own boots on dry stone, the ordinary beauty of the place he had given 17 years to. And in the dream he was simply walking, not toward anything in particular, not away from anything, just walking the way he walked when the day was clean and the territory was his. And the work was exactly what it should be. He woke feeling something he recognized after a moment as readiness. Not the tense readiness of anticipation or dread, but the steady readiness of a man who has made a decision and carried it to the point where the decision becomes action and the action is at hand. The organization's office was in a building downtown, unassuming from the outside, the kind of building that occupied itself with serious work without advertising the fact. He arrived 10 minutes early. The woman who had answered his call was named Ruth Ellard, and she was older than he had imagined from her voice, somewhere in her late 60s. With the kind of face that had spent decades listening carefully to things that were hard to hear and had developed a particular quality of stillness in response. She shook his hand and led him to a conference room and closed the door and asked if he wanted coffee. And when he said yes, she poured it herself from a carafe on the side table without any ceremony and sat down across from him and said, "Tell me everything, from the beginning." He told her everything, from the beginning. He spoke for nearly 2 hours without significant interruption. Ruth Ellard listened with the quality of attention that he associated with the best rangers he had known, people who could receive information without distorting it through the filter of their own response, people who understood that the first task was accurate reception and that interpretation came afterward. She made notes. She asked occasional clarifying questions, precise and minimal, the questions of someone who already understood the broad territory and needed only to confirm specific details. When he finished, she sat quietly for a moment, looking at her notes. Then she said that what he had found was consistent with a category of program that her organization had been building a documentary record of for more than 15 years. She said the designation he had copied from the letterhead of the official documents was one that appeared in other records they held, always in connection with programs operating in remote or isolated locations, always during the same general historical period, always involving human subjects who had been characterized in program records in ways that stripped their personhood from the official documentation. She said they had never before had physical access to an intact facility of this kind. What he had brought them was significant in a way that she wanted him to understand fully, not just as a piece of evidence in a broader case, as a physical location that could be examined, documented, and eventually, through the appropriate legal process, open to the world. She said the name he had given her, the name signed at the bottom of the doctor's letter, was a name that appeared in their existing records. The doctor had died 11 years ago. He had a daughter, still living, who had been trying for years to understand what her father had been involved in during a period of his career that he had never spoken of directly. The daughter had known something had happened. She had not known what or where. Marcus sat with that for a moment. He thought about the letter, about the 3 pages of careful handwriting in a small and increasingly unsteady hand, about the names signed at the bottom of it. The man had written the letter and put it in the filing cabinet and sealed the door and lived with what he had done for decades before dying with it still largely unspoken. His daughter had been trying to understand from outside a wall that he had never fully opened, and the letter was still in the cabinet, waiting. He told Ruth Ellard about the letter in detail. He described its contents as completely as he could. He watched her expression as he spoke and saw in it something that was not quite grief but occupied the same territory. The recognition of a pattern she had seen before in different specifics. The understanding that what he was describing was not an anomaly, but an instance. One case in a larger record of institutional behavior that had left its damage scattered across decades and families and the lives of people who had never been given an accounting. She asked him what he wanted to happen. He had thought about this. He had been thinking about it since the first morning in the chamber, and the answer had clarified itself over the 2 weeks of waiting in the way that answers clarify when you give them the space of honest consideration. He said he wanted the families of the people in those files to know what had happened. He wanted the people whose names were in those boxes, whose photographs and letters and stopped watches were sitting in the dark of that storage area, to be returned to their full personhood in whatever record was eventually produced. He wanted the institutional record to be corrected. He wanted accountability, which he understood was a complicated word in this context, given the decades that had passed and the deaths of many of the people who had operated the program. But accountability did not only mean prosecution. It meant acknowledgement. It meant the official record reflecting the truth of what had happened rather than the silence that had been maintained in the truth's place. He said he also wanted the facility preserved and documented properly before anything about it became public, so that the physical evidence was secured against the possibility of interference. Ruth Ellard nodded at each of these. She said her organization could pursue all of it. She said the process would be long and would encounter resistance, and that there would be points at which the resistance would be significant and discouraging. She said she wanted him to understand that before. They went further so that he was not surprised by it later. He said he understood. He said he had spent 17 years working in a place where the outcomes of patient effort were rarely fast and frequently incomplete, and where the work was worth doing regardless. She said that was the right disposition for what they were undertaking. She asked him about his own situation, his employment, his professional standing, what he stood to lose if this became connected to his name. He told her the truth, that he had withheld information from his chain of command, that he had accessed a facility without authorization in a technical sense, that he had removed documentation in the form of photographs and notes. She told him that the organization had legal resources to support him and that the protections available to federal employees who brought forward evidence of governmental wrongdoing were significant, though not absolute, and that his 17 years of clean service would matter. He said he understood that too. He signed a formal agreement that afternoon, authorizing the organization to act on his behalf and on behalf of the documentary record he had provided. He handed Ruth Ellard a copy of his notebook and a copy of every photograph on his personal camera's memory card. He kept the originals. They agreed that the organization would proceed first by securing independent legal access to the facility before any public disclosure, that this process would take time, and that Marcus would continue his normal duties in the interim while they worked the institutional and legal angles that were required. He drove back to his motel and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the wall and thought about the fact that it had begun. Whatever was going to happen, it had begun. The information was out of the sealed room and in the hands of people whose job it was to carry it forward. He was no longer the only person who knew. The feeling that produced in him was not relief exactly. It was more like the feeling of setting down a weight you have been carrying so long that you had begun to adapt your gait to it. And now that it was set down, you could feel the exact shape and mass of it in the absence of it, could feel how long you had been carrying it in the ache of the muscles that had been doing the carrying. He was not lighter. He was simply more accurately aware of the weight. He drove back to his sector the next morning. The following months were the most demanding of his professional life, not because the work changed, but because his relationship to the work changed. He continued walking his trails, documenting his canyon, filing his logs, making his check-in calls. He continued being, to every outward measure, the same ranger he had always been. But inside that routine, he was also living the parallel experience of what was unfolding outside it. The news that came to him in careful communications from Ruth Ellard on his personal phone, always brief and always in general terms while the legal process was still in its early stages. The organization had filed the initial legal motions to secure independent access to the facility. The motions had been met with what Ruth Ellard described, in her measured language, as vigorous procedural resistance from several federal agencies. This was expected. The agencies had been given the minimum information necessary to establish the legal basis for the access claim, and had responded by deploying procedural obstacles of the kind that institutions deploy when they're trying to slow a process they cannot fully stop. The organization's legal team had anticipated this and was working through each obstacle methodically. There had been contact with the doctor's daughter. Ruth Ellard described this only briefly, protecting the woman's privacy, but the brief description was enough to give Marcus a sense of it. The daughter had been told that her father's letter had been found and that it was intact, and that it would be returned to her through the appropriate legal process. Ruth Ellard said the woman had not spoken for several seconds after being told this. Then she had asked if the letter had been signed. Ruth Ellard had said yes. The woman had made a sound that Ruth Ellard described simply as someone receiving something they had waited a very long time for. Marcus sat with his phone after reading that message for a long time. 6 months after his first visit to the facility, the legal access was secured. It had taken longer than Ruth Ellard had initially estimated, because the procedural resistance had been more sustained than anticipated, because one of the agencies had attempted a classification argument that required a separate set of legal responses, and because the process of establishing clear jurisdiction over a facility built on protected federal land by a program whose institutional parentage was disputed had raised complications that required careful untangling. But it had been secured. A team was going in, properly equipped, legally authorized, with investigators and archivists and a documentary film crew that the organization had brought in to ensure the physical record was captured in the most complete and defensible form possible. Marcus was asked if he wanted to be present for the initial entry. He said yes. He drove out on a Tuesday morning in early spring, the desert shifting toward the tentative green that came with the warming months, the canyon walls catching the morning light in a way that was particular to that season, the angles changing as the sun climbed higher in the sky and the long shadows of winter shortened and softened. He met the team at the trailhead. There were 8 people in addition to himself and Ruth Ellard. He led them into the canyon without speaking much. The terrain required attention, and the group was finding its footing in the unfamiliar landscape, and Marcus understood instinctively that what was called for here was guidance rather than narration. When they reached the section of canyon wall, and he showed them the door, there was a silence in the group that he recognized. The silence of people encountering something whose existence changes the shape of the world slightly. The way that first sight of a landform you have only seen on maps changes your understanding of the map. They stood and looked at the disguised iron door in the cliff face, and Marcus watched them look at it. And he understood that this moment was another kind of documentation, that the experience of these people seeing this for the first time was part of the record being made. He opened the door the way he had opened it before, carefully, working the mechanism with the patience of someone who knew its specific resistance. The hinges screamed in the canyon air, the same sound they had made every time, carrying across the rock walls and rising toward the sky. The investigators moved inside in sequence. The documentary crew filmed everything. Ruth Ellard stood beside Marcus at the entrance for a moment before going in, and she said, quietly, without making a production of it, that he had done the right thing. He nodded. He did not say anything. There was nothing that needed saying. Inside the chamber, the investigators moved with the careful competence of people who had done this kind of work before, in different locations, with different specifics, but within the same general territory of buried institutional truth. They photographed, cataloged, collected samples, documented the structural details of the space. They went through the filing cabinets with the methodical care of archivists. They found the doctor's letter. Marcus watched the lead archivist open it, read it, and set it carefully on the cataloging table with the same deliberateness he himself had used when he first held it. He watched her read the name at the bottom, and understood from the slight change in her posture that she recognized it. They went into the inner room. Marcus stayed at the doorway while the investigators worked inside it. He did not need to go back in. He had been in it enough times to have it completely. He watched them document the chair, the restraints, the instrumentation on the wall, the card in its frame. He watched the documentary camera record all of it, the beam of the professional lighting equipment filling the small room with a clarity that the hand lamp had never provided, showing every detail with an unflinching completeness that felt both necessary and almost unbearable. Then one of the investigators, a woman named Torres who had barely spoken during the walk-in, stopped in front of the wall where the handwriting was. Marcus saw the moment she found it. He saw the slight forward lean of her body, the way her head tilted as she brought her light in at an angle to read the shallow-cut letters. She read it twice, the same way he had read it the first time. Then she turned and looked back at him in the doorway, and he saw in her face the same expression he imagined had been on his own face the first morning he stood in this place. The expression of someone receiving something that reconfigures the interior landscape permanently. Remember, they called this progress. We called it by our names. The documentary camera captured it. The archivists documented it. The investigators included it in their formal record. But Marcus understood that the recording of it in all these official and semi-official forms was not what honored it. What honored it was the fact of being read by another human being. The fact of the communication traveling across whatever years separated the person who scratched it into the concrete from the people now standing in the room it had been waiting in. That was what the writer had trusted would happen. That was what had happened. The rest was process, necessary and important, but secondary to the essential fact of the message having been received. The investigation took 3 full days in the facility. Marcus was present for the first day and part of the second, then returned to his patrol duties while the team continued their work. He received updates from Ruth Ellard in the evenings. The personal effects boxes had been cataloged. The vials had been collected for analysis. The full contents of all 4 filing cabinets had been archived. The structural integrity of the facility had been assessed and documented. The documentary footage amounted to many hours of material. On the 3rd day, when the team came back out of the canyon for the last time, they sealed the facility door with an official notice affixed to its exterior surface, a legal notice declaring it a site under active federal investigation. The notice was the first thing that had ever been attached to the outside of that door. It seemed, to Marcus, like the door finally telling the truth about itself. The months that followed were months of process, of legal filings and institutional negotiations, and the slow, grinding work of accountability operating against the resistance of institutions that had been practicing resistance for decades. Marcus was interviewed formally by federal investigators on 3 separate occasions. He gave the same account each time, precisely and completely, without embellishment and without evasion. His 17 years of service were, as Ruth Ellard had predicted, relevant to how he was treated. He was not prosecuted for his initial unauthorized access. He was formally reprimanded for failing to report his discovery immediately. Through proper channels, a reprimand that was noted in his record and that he accepted without argument. The reprimand was a line on a form. It had no bearing on anything that mattered. The story broke publicly 11 months after Marcus had first pulled that iron door open in the canyon wall. It broke in the way that significant stories break when they have been properly built, not as a single explosive disclosure, but as a carefully assembled account that could not be dismissed as speculation or inaccuracy, that came with documentary evidence and legal access, and the names of specific people and specific programs and specific dates. Ruth Ellard's organization had worked with a team of journalists who specialized in this kind of investigative work, people who understood how to present evidence of institutional wrongdoing in a way that was both accurate and resistant to the counter-narratives that institutions deploy when their history is exposed. Marcus read the first published piece at his desk in the station on a morning in October, almost exactly 1 year after he had stood at the base of the canyon wall and noticed the shadow that was not a shadow. The piece was long and carefully constructed, beginning with the facility itself, with the door hidden in the cliff face, with the experience of entering it, described through a combination of the documentary footage and the testimony of the investigators. It then moved outward to the history, to the program's origins and authorization and operational period, to the people who had been designated as participants, to what had happened to them. It used their names, real names reconstructed through the combination of the program's own designation records and the investigative work that had connected those designations to actual identities. It used their names throughout, not their numbers, their names. The doctor's daughter was quoted in the piece. Marcus had not been in contact with her directly. He had given her father's letter back to her through the legal process, and he knew from Ruth Ellard that she had read it, that she had kept it, that it had been the thing she had needed most from the discovery. She was quoted saying that her father had not been a good man in every way, had not done everything right, had participated in things he should not have participated in. But she said that he had also known it, at the end, and had tried to leave a record of knowing it, and that this was not absolution but was something. She said it was something. Marcus read that part twice. He thought about the letter, about the doctor sitting in this facility or somewhere near it and writing 3 pages in a small and careful hand, and folding them, and placing them in a filing cabinet, and walking away knowing that what he left behind was insufficient, and doing it anyway. He thought about the difference between insufficient and nothing. He thought about the distance between knowing you have done wrong and doing what you can do about it given the constraints of who you are and what you have become. The distance was large, but the doctor had crossed whatever part of it he could cross. The letter was evidence of that. The public response to the story was substantial and sustained. It was not uncomplicated. There were people who disputed aspects of the account, who questioned the characterization of the program, who deployed the familiar arguments of historical context and national necessity that were always deployed in these situations. There were people who questioned Marcus specifically, who suggested his motivations were not what he claimed, who cast his account of the discovery in a suspicious light. He had expected all of this and was neither surprised nor particularly disturbed by it. He had spent 17 years in a place where the landscape was real and specific regardless of what anyone said about it, and he understood that truth did not require consensus to remain true. What he had not fully anticipated was the response from the families. Ruth Ellard had told him there would be family responses, that the publication of the names and the exposure of the program would reach people who had spent decades without answers, and that these people would react in ways that spanned the full range of human response to the restoration of a truth long denied. She had prepared him for this in the general sense. She had not been able to prepare him for the specific sense, for the particular experience of receiving, several weeks after the story broke, a handwritten letter at the ranger station, forwarded through Ruth Ellard's office, from an elderly woman in another state. The woman was in her 80s. She had been a young woman when her brother was taken from her family, and she had been told he had gone to participate in a medical research program voluntarily, and that the program was confidential, and that she would be contacted when it was appropriate. She had never been contacted. She had spent the subsequent decades in the particular hell of an unanswered question, the not knowing that is in some ways worse than the worst knowledge because it gives the imagination no constraint. She had looked for him for years. She had eventually stopped looking not because she gave up, but because the looking had begun to cost her everything else, and she had a family of her own, and she had made the terrible choice to continue living. She had read the story when it broke. She had found her brother's name in the list of documented participants. She had been told by Ruth Ellard's organization that his personal effects box was being processed through the legal system and would be returned to the family once the evidentiary requirements were satisfied. She had been told that his photograph was in the box. She wrote to Marcus because she wanted him to know that she had spent 60 years not knowing and that the knowing, even now, even as painful as it was better than the not knowing. She wanted him to know that she had thought about what it meant, a ranger walking his canyon on an ordinary morning and pressing his hand against a cliff face and finding iron, and she wanted him to know that she understood the odds of it, that she understood it might never have happened, that the door might have stayed hidden for another 50 years or forever, that no one might have ever found it. And she wanted him to know that for her. Knowing was a gift she had not expected to receive. She signed it with her name. Marcus sat at his desk for a long time after reading that letter. The light outside his window was the low, warm light of late afternoon in October, the same light it had been when he drove back to his sector a year ago after calling Ruth Ellard from the payphone, the same light that fell across his desk on the evening he had written his full account in his notebook for the first time. The canyon was in that light outside his window, the walls of it going amber and then deep red as the sun moved. The ravens on the eastern ridge doing whatever ravens did in the last hour before dark. He read the letter again. He looked at the names signed at the bottom of it. Not a number. A name. He thought about the words on the wall. Remember, they called this progress. We called it by our names. He thought about what it meant that the message had traveled. That someone in a sealed room with something sharp and whatever time or strength they had left had scratched those words into concrete and left them there, and that decades later a ranger had found them, and that a legal organization had documented them, and that a journalist had written about them, and that an elderly woman in another state had read the story and found her brother's name in it, and was now writing letters to people she had never met because the act of writing them was a way of continuing to receive the truth that had been returned to her after 60 years. He thought about what it meant that the message had worked, that the person who wrote remember had trusted that the word would reach someone who could do something with it, and that it had. Not immediately, not easily, not without resistance and delay and the long, grinding work of accountability moving against institutional inertia. But it had. Marcus set the letter on his desk. He looked out the window at the canyon in the last of the afternoon light. He thought about all the mornings he had walked out of the station and into that landscape, all the trails he had covered and the observations he had made and the reports he had filed. He thought about the particular morning a year ago when he had stopped at the base of the canyon wall because something was wrong in a way he could not immediately articulate, and pressed his fingers against the stone and found iron. He had not been looking for it. He had been looking at a section of cliff face for new fracture lines. He had been doing his job. And his job, in the end, had been the thing that mattered, not the dramatic version of the job, not the version that involved chases or confrontations or fire, but the ordinary version, the patient and attentive version, the version that required 17 years of walking the same ground and learning its specific language well enough to hear when something in that language was wrong. He had heard it. He had pressed his hand against the place where the wrongness was and found what was under the surface. That was all. That was everything. He would continue doing it. He would go back out tomorrow morning and walk his trails and check his markers and file his logs and make his check-in calls and drink his coffee and watch the ravens. The facility was in legal hands now. The families were being found. The record was being corrected. The work of justice was moving, imperfectly and slowly and against resistance, in the direction of the truth. He could not accelerate that process significantly from where he stood, and he had learned over 17 years that the acceptance of what you cannot accelerate was not defeat but clarity. What he could do was stay, could keep walking, could press his hand against every surface that felt wrong until he understood what was under it, could refuse to look away from the things the landscape was trying to tell him, even when those things were enormous and terrible and exceeded the boundaries of what any one person could hold comfortably. He folded the elderly woman's letter and placed it carefully in the footlocker in his bunk room, beside his personal notebook, beside the copies of the photographs he had taken in the chamber. He locked the footlocker. He went back to his desk. He poured a cup of coffee that had gone cold and drank it anyway, the way he always did when he had been thinking too hard to remember to drink it while it was hot. Outside the window, the canyon was going dark, the walls losing their color as the light failed, the sky above the canyon rim deepening from pale blue to the first suggestion of purple. The stars would come soon. They always did out here, unobstructed by the competing light of any city, arriving in their full numbers in the clear desert sky, like a testimony to something vast and indifferent and beautiful. He sat at his desk in the station that was his home and looked out at the canyon that was his work and thought about all the things that were still true. The canyon was real. The facility was real. The people who had been in it were real, had been real all along, had always been real behind the designation numbers and the bureaucratic language, had remained real through the decades in which the institutional record denied them. Their reality. They were real now in a different way, in the way of people whose names have been spoken aloud after a long silence, restored to the record that had tried to erase them. Remember. He remembered. He would continue to remember. That was, in the end, the thing the words on the wall had asked of him, and it was the simplest and most serious thing that any piece of writing has ever asked of its reader. Not to fix what had happened, not to undo what could not be undone, simply to hold the knowledge of it, to carry it forward into the world, To refuse the comfort of not knowing that was always available to anyone who did not press their hand against the wall. He had pressed his hand against the wall. He would not stop. The canyon held its silence outside his window, the ancient, pressurized silence of a place that had been keeping its own counsel since long before any human being arrived to misuse it. The stars appeared above the rim. First one, and then several, and then too many to count. The same stars that had been above this canyon on every night of the 11 years the program had run in the sealed chamber beneath the cliff face, indifferent to what was happening below them, offering no judgment and no comfort, simply present, burning in the dark with a persistence that asked nothing of anyone and continued regardless. Marcus watched them for a while. Then he turned off the desk lamp and went to bed. In the morning, he would make coffee. He would put on his boots. He would walk out into the canyon and do his work. He would press his hand against every surface that deserved pressing, and he would listen for the thing underneath, and he would not look away. That was all. That was everything. It was enough. The letter from the elderly woman was not the last one that came. Over the weeks following the story's publication, Ruth Ellard's organization received correspondence from 11 other families. Some wrote brief notes, a few sentences, the kind of message a person composes when they have too much to say and no adequate vessel for it. Others sent longer accounts, histories of the decades they had spent inside the particular darkness of an unanswered question, trying to describe what it had cost them in a language that was never quite equal to the cost. A few sent photographs, old ones, the kind printed on paper stock that had thickened and yellowed at the edges, showing faces from decades ago, young men and women in the ordinary poses of ordinary lives, standing in front of houses or sitting at kitchen tables or looking at the camera with the expression of someone who does not know they are standing at the edge of something. Marcus was not shown these photographs directly. Ruth Ellard mentioned them in one of her updates, briefly, as an indication of the scope of response. He thought about them for a long time after she mentioned them. He thought about the gap between the face in the photograph and the number in the filing cabinet, about how much had to be deliberately removed from a human being's account of themselves to make that translation possible, about the institutional mechanisms required to look at a person and see a designation, about the people who had operated those mechanisms and the decisions, made repeatedly and with full awareness, that had been required to keep them running. He thought about this on his morning walks. The canyon received these thoughts the way it received everything, without comment, in the absolute democracy of its indifference. The red walls rose on either side of him, and the ravens called from the eastern ridge, and the dry wash crunched under his boots, and the sage was silver and sharp in the morning air. He walked, and he thought, and the thinking did not resolve into anything clean, but it deepened, the way understanding deepens when you stay with something long enough without demanding that it simplify itself for your comfort. Calloway, his district supervisor, called him in for a meeting 6 weeks after the story became public. Marcus had been expecting this. He drove the 2 hours to the district office on a gray morning in November, the desert flat and cold on either side of the highway, the mountains to the north holding the first snow of the season on their upper elevations. He wore his uniform. He arrived on time. He sat in the chair across from Calloway's desk with the same posture he brought to every formal meeting, upright and unhurried, giving nothing away that he had not decided to give. Calloway was not a hostile man. He had not been hostile when he issued the formal reprimand, and he was not hostile now. He was a man in a complicated position, which Marcus understood and for which he had a measure of sympathy. Calloway was responsible for a district that now contained, in the public record, a story about a sealed federal facility operating on protected federal land without the knowledge of the rangers who patrolled that land. This was not a comfortable position for a district supervisor, and the people above Calloway in the chain of command were, by several accounts Marcus had received secondhand, not in comfortable positions either. Calloway asked him how he was doing. Marcus said he was fine. Calloway asked about the sector, about the patrol routes, about whether the increased media attention had brought any unauthorized visitors to the canyon. Marcus said it had brought some. A small number of people had hiked into the canyon, hoping to find the facility, drawn by the story. He had turned them back politely and filed the appropriate incident reports. The legal notice on the door of the facility had been vandalized once, a corner torn away, and he had reported this, and it had been replaced. Calloway nodded at all of this. Then he asked, with a care in his phrasing that indicated he had thought about how to ask it, whether Marcus had considered what came next for him. Marcus said he was not sure he understood the question. Calloway said that some people in situations like his chose to move on, that the association of a posting with a significant public story sometimes made the posting difficult to continue occupying with the same clarity of purpose it had held before. He said this without pressure, as an observation, leaving Marcus room to take it whichever direction he chose. Marcus said he was not interested in moving on. He said the canyon was his work and he intended to continue doing his work. He said the discovery of the facility had not changed his relationship to the land he patrolled, only his understanding of what that land had contained, and that an expanded understanding of a place was not a reason to leave it, but a reason to remain with greater awareness of its full dimensions. He said this clearly and without heat, because he felt neither defensive nor aggressive about it. It was simply true. Calloway looked at him for a moment. Then he said that he had put the same answer in his report to the people above him, because it was the answer he had expected Marcus to give, and that the people above him had accepted it, and that Marcus should consider the meeting concluded. Marcus drove back to his sector in the gray afternoon. He thought about Calloway on the drive, about the people above Calloway, about the chain of command that ran upward from his station in the canyon to offices and buildings and cities where decisions were made about land and people and what records showed and what they did not. He thought about how much of what had happened in that sealed chamber had required cooperation from people at various points along exactly that kind of chain, people who had signed and forwarded and approved and filed, and in some cases simply not asked the questions that were available to them to ask. The chain of command was not a mechanism that operated independently of the people who composed it. It was the sum of their decisions, and the decisions had been made, one at a time, by people who had names and positions and the full human capacity for choosing otherwise. He got back to the station as the light was failing. He made coffee and sat outside and watched the stars come out above the canyon rim and did not try to resolve anything. 3 months after the story broke, the first formal congressional inquiry was announced. It covered not only the program Marcus had found documentation of, but 2 other programs from the same historical period that Ruth Ellard's organization had been building cases around for years. The inquiry was not, by the standards of institutional accountability, a swift or decisive instrument. Marcus understood this. He had been briefed by Ruth Ellard's legal team on what a congressional inquiry typically produced and what it typically did not, and the picture was not one of rapid, clean resolution. It was one of long process, of testimony and documentation and counter-argument and procedural delay and the occasional significant finding buried in a report that ran to hundreds of pages. But it was also, Ruth Ellard had said, the form of official acknowledgement that created the most durable public record. The things entered into the congressional record had a permanence that other forms of documentation did not possess. They could not be quietly reclassified or moved to a sealed archive or otherwise managed out of public reach. They sat in the record. They remained in the record. The record was accessible. Marcus was asked to provide written testimony. He did so over the course of several evenings at his desk in the station, writing carefully in the same deliberate way he wrote his patrol logs, attending to precision and completeness, offering only what he knew directly, and making clear the distinction between what he had observed and what he had inferred. The testimony ran to 43 pages. He sent it through Ruth Ellard's organization, which reviewed it for legal purposes before it was formally submitted. Ruth Ellard told him it was one of the clearest and most useful pieces of testimony they had seen in cases of this kind, that its strength lay in its refusal to claim more than it could support, that investigators and committee members would find it credible precisely because it held to the exact boundary of what one person had seen and done and understood. He received a formal acknowledgement from the committee several weeks later. It was a standard form letter. He filed it in his personal footlocker with the other documents he had accumulated and thought nothing more of it. Spring came to the canyon with its usual deliberateness, the warmth arriving not all at once, but in increments, the mornings losing their deepest cold, the first green appearing in the dry wash beds where water had moved during the winter rains. The mountain lions were active again. He photographed a fresh track near the Seep Spring on a morning in March, crouched in the same position he had been in when he photographed the track the previous October, the morning before he found the door. He photographed it and moved on, and continued his patrol. What he had not anticipated, and what arrived on a Tuesday morning in early April without any warning from Ruth Ellard or anyone else, was the woman who appeared at the end of the dirt track that led to his station and stood there in the morning sun with a small bag over her shoulder and a look on her face that he recognized, though he had never seen her before, as the look of someone who has been traveling towards something for a very long time and has finally arrived. She was perhaps 60 years old, slim and upright, with dark hair gone gray at the temples and eyes that held a quality of long focus, as though she had spent years looking at horizons and had developed a particular relationship with distance. She introduced herself simply, with her first name, which was Sophia, and she said she was the daughter of one of the participants. She said she had found the station through the public record of his sector assignment, which was available through the agency's public-facing directories. She said she had not contacted him in advance because she had been afraid he would tell her not to come. He stood in the doorway of the station for a moment, looking at her. Then he said she should come in. He made coffee. She sat at the table in the small kitchen area of the station and held the cup in both hands and looked around the room with the attentive curiosity of someone cataloging a new environment. He sat across from her and waited. He had learned over many years that the most useful thing you could offer a person who had traveled a long way to say something was the unhurried space to say it. She told him about her father. He had been a young man when he was taken into the program, in his late 20s, with a wife and a daughter not yet 2 years old. He had been, by the family's understanding, taken in connection with a workplace incident, something that had brought him to the attention of authorities, the details of which were never fully explained to the family. They had been told he was participating in a study. They had been told participation was a condition of some legal matter that was never specified clearly. They had been told he would be back within a few months. He had not been back within a few months. He had not come back at all. Sophia had been too young to remember him. Her memory of her father was entirely constructed from the accounts of her mother, who had lived in the particular suspension of a person waiting for news that stopped coming, and from the single photograph that her mother had kept on the dresser in the bedroom for the rest of her life. Her mother had died 12 years ago, still waiting in the way that had become so habitual it no longer expressed itself as waiting, but simply as the texture of how she lived, the particular absence at the center of an otherwise ordinary life. Sophia had read the story when it broke. She had found her father's designation number cross-referenced in the supplementary documentation that Ruth Ellard's organization had made available to families through their victim liaison process. She had gone through that process and had been told what the records showed about her father's time in the facility. She had received confirmation that he had been among those whose participation had been discontinued. She had been told when. She had been given the specific date, which was something she had never had before, the particular day her father had ceased to exist, a fact that gave the absence in her life a precise location and time that it had not previously possessed. She said that having the date was harder than she had expected it to be, and also better. That the hardness and the betterment were not in opposition but were the same thing, that knowing was always both. She looked at her coffee cup. She said she had come because she wanted to see the place. Not the facility itself. She was not asking to go to the facility. She understood there were legal restrictions, and she respected them. She wanted to see the canyon. She wanted to stand in the landscape where her father had spent the last period of his life and understand, as much as a person could understand from the outside of an experience, what that place was. She wanted to see it with her own eyes rather than in photographs or documentary footage, because there was a difference between those things and being present in a place that mattered to the story of someone you had lost, and she had lived long enough without that kind of presence. Marcus looked at her across the kitchen table for a moment. Then he said he would take her in. They walked the canyon that afternoon. He led and she followed, and he did not talk much, offering only the occasional navigational comment. This trail turns here. The footing is loose on this section. Watch the overhang just past that boulder. She walked steadily and in silence, looking at the walls around her, at the sky above the canyon rim, at the canyon floor and its dry wash beds and the sage growing in the places where the soil was deep enough to hold roots. She looked at everything with the particular attention of someone for whom looking is not passive but active, a form of receiving. He brought her to the section of the canyon wall where the facility was without telling her in advance that they were approaching it. When they reached it, and she saw the legal notice on the surface of the disguised door, She stopped walking. She stood and looked at the door for a long time without speaking. He stood slightly behind her and did not speak either. The canyon held its silence around them. Far above, on the eastern ridge, the ravens called once and were quiet. She reached out and pressed her palm flat against the surface of the door. Not the legal notice. The surface beside it, the treated iron underneath the stone-colored coating, cold in the shadow of the cliff. She held her hand there for a long time. He watched her and understood that he was witnessing something that was not for him to interpret, that what was passing between her palm and that surface was between her and her father and the fact of this place and whatever language the dead used to communicate with the living through the cold iron of doors that were meant to stay hidden forever. She took her hand back eventually. She turned around and looked at the canyon behind her, the walls and the sky and the long reach of the wash bed stretching southward. She looked at it the way you look at something you are committing to memory, holding it with your whole attention so that it will be there when you need it. Then she said, quietly, that she had one question. He said she could ask it. She said she wanted to know what it had felt like. Not the discovery, not the logistics of it. She had read all of that. She wanted to know what it had felt like to stand in that chamber for the first time and understand what it was. He thought about this for a moment. He took his time with it because it deserved his time and because she had traveled a significant distance to ask it. He said it had felt like the canyon getting larger. Like walking in a landscape you thought you knew and finding that it had a room you had not been told about, and understanding that the room had always been there, and that the things that had happened in the room had happened in the same canyon he had been walking for 17 years, in the same red rock desert under the same stars, and that the not knowing had not protected anyone from those things, had not changed them or softened them or made them less real, and that knowing was therefore not a burden but a correction, something the world owed to itself and had been late in paying. She listened to this. Then she said that was the right way to think about it. They walked back to the station in the late afternoon. He made more coffee, and they sat outside in the cooling air and watched the light change on the canyon walls, the red going to amber, and the amber going to gold, and the gold going to the particular pale bronze of the last minutes before dark. She talked a little about her life, about her work, about the family she had made, the children she had raised who were now grown and had children of their own, who carried in them without knowing it the genetic fact of a man who had died in a sealed room in a desert canyon before any of them were born. She said she was going to tell them now. She said she had waited because she had not known what to tell them. Now she did. He asked her if she was going to be all right. She said that was a complicated question and that the honest answer was that she had been all right in the way of a person who has adapted to a significant absence, and that she would continue to be all right in that way, and that the knowing did not undo the adaptation but it changed its character, because now the absence had a shape where before it had just been formless. And a shaped absence was something you could work with in a way that a formless one was not. She left the next morning. He walked her to her car at the end of the dirt track, and she shook his hand and thanked him and got in and drove away, and the dust from the track rose behind her vehicle and settled slowly back onto the road after she was gone. He stood there for a moment in the morning air. Then he went back to the station, put on his pack, and went to work. The congressional inquiry produced its initial findings the following autumn, nearly 2 years after Marcus had found the door. The findings were detailed and carefully constructed, naming the program, naming the institutional authorization, describing the scope and duration of the program's operation, and characterizing the treatment of participants in terms that were formal but morally unambiguous. They recommended a formal government apology to the families of those who had been harmed. They recommended a compensation process. They recommended that the facility be preserved as a site of historical and civic significance. Ruth Ellard told him the findings were the strongest the organization had seen in a case of this kind. She said the physical evidence, the intact facility with its documentation and its personal effects boxes and the words on the wall, had made the difference. Cases built entirely on recovered documents were easier to dispute. A room you could walk into and stand in. A chair bolted to the floor with leather restraints still attached to its frame, a card in a metal frame that used the word efficiency in proximity to human suffering. Those things did not argue for themselves in a way that required interpretation. They argued in the way that physical reality argues, by simply being what they were. Marcus was asked, through the inquiry process, to testify in person before the committee. He drove to the city for this. wearing his uniform, carrying the notebook that he had kept since the first morning in the chamber. The room where the testimony was taken was large and formal and full of people, lawyers and staff members and committee members and journalists, and, seated in a separate section marked with a small printed placard, the family members and representatives who had come to hear. He saw Sophia in that section. She was sitting 3 rows from the front, wearing a dark jacket, her hands folded in her lap. She saw him when he took his seat at the witness table, and she gave him the slight nod of someone who has traveled a long way to sit in a room where the truth is being spoken aloud for the first time and finds the experience exactly as necessary and exactly as painful as they expected it to be. He testified for 2.5 hours. He gave the same account he had given every time, precise and complete, without embellishment and without evasion. When the committee members asked him questions, he answered them in the same terms, holding to the boundary of what he knew directly and saying clearly when something moved beyond that boundary. When one committee member asked him whether he thought the system had failed, he said that the system had worked exactly as it had been designed to work in the period when the program was active, that the failure was in the design, and that the design had been chosen by people exercising the same range of choices available to any person in any institutional position, which was a different statement from saying the system had failed and a more accurate one. When the testimony was done and he stood to leave, Sophia was waiting at the edge of the room. She thanked him again, briefly, without ceremony. She said that hearing it spoken in that room, formally and on record, had been different from reading it. She said it had made it more real in a way she had not anticipated, that the formal speaking of a truth into an official record was its own kind of act, distinct from the knowing of the truth, and that both were necessary. He said he understood that. He said he had felt the same thing, standing in the room where the words were scratched into the concrete, that seeing something physical changed the weight of knowing it in a way that no description fully prepared you for. She said she was going to bring her children to the canyon. When the formal access process was established and visitors could come to the site, she was going to bring them and walk them in the way he had walked her, and stand with them in front of the door, and press their hands against the surface, and tell them the name of the man they carried in their blood who had been inside those walls, and who had deserved to come home, and had not. He said he thought that was exactly the right thing to do. The formal government apology came 18 months after the findings, issued at a ceremony Marcus watched on his personal tablet at his desk in the station. The official at the podium read each name in alphabetical order with a silence of several seconds between each one, long enough for the name to exist by itself in the air of that room, to be heard as a name and not as an entry in a list. Marcus counted the silences and thought about the designation numbers in the filing cabinet and what it had cost to restore the names to the record, and how long it had taken, and how many people had carried pieces of that cost without ever receiving the accounting they were owed. When the last name had been read and the last silence held, the official said that what had been done in the facility was wrong, without qualification or the hedging language of institutional self-protection. Wrong in the complete sense of the word. Wrong in the treatment of human beings as instruments. Wrong in the concealment. Wrong in the decades of silence. He said the apology was insufficient to the wrong, and that this insufficiency should be acknowledged rather than obscured. He said the government was sorry. He said sorry was a small word for a large debt, and that he was saying it with full awareness of that disproportion. Marcus closed the recording. He put the tablet in the desk drawer. He sat for a moment in the station that was his home, in the chair at the desk where he had written his full account for the first time, in the room where the topographic map of his sector hung on the wall with its new red circle in the northern arm of the canyon. Then he got up and went outside. The canyon was in the late light of afternoon, the walls going through their daily sequence of color change. The ravens were on the eastern ridge. The sage smell was in the air. The dry wash ran ahead of him southward in the direction of the Seep Spring, where the mountain lions came to drink and left their tracks in the damp clay for him to photograph and document and add to the record that he kept of this place and everything that moved through it. Sophia sent him a short note when the compensation process concluded. She said the money would go to her grandchildren's education. She said her father would have found this satisfying. She said she did. He read the note in the morning, standing at the kitchen table with his coffee still hot, and then he put it carefully in the footlocker with the other things he had kept. The elderly woman's letter. The copy of his 43 pages of testimony. The notebook from the chamber, its pages filled with the precise documentation of the first day. The committee's form letter, the copy of his full written account. These things sat in the footlocker together and would remain there for as long as he remained in this station, which he intended to be a long time. He locked the footlocker. He put on his pack. He went out into the morning. The canyon received him in the way it always had, without distinction, offering the same indifferent beauty to his presence that it offered to the wind and the ravens and the mountain lions and the sage. The walls rose on either side, the same red rock that had stood through everything that human beings had done in and below and against them, indifferent and permanent and entirely themselves. The sky above the rim was the hard blue of high desert morning. He walked north, toward the section of canyon wall where the door was. He did not intend to stop there. He was on a patrol route that passed near it and would continue past it, and he would walk the full route as he always did, checking and documenting and attending to the territory that was his responsibility. But he would pass near it, as he passed near it every several days now, and he would see the legal notice on its surface, weathered and intact, and the disguised iron behind it, and the seam running vertical and horizontal to mark its rectangle, visible to him in a way it would never stop being visible. The permanent alteration of his vision of this wall that had come from the single act of pressing his palm against it and finding iron. He stopped when he reached it. He stood in front of it for a moment in the morning light. The notice was there. The seam was there. The cold iron was there behind its coating. And behind the iron the passage and the chamber and the chair and the filing cabinets and the boxes and the words on the wall, all of it sitting in the sealed dark the way it had been sitting for decades, permanent and specific and finally known. He pressed his palm flat against the stone beside the door. He held it there for a moment, feeling the specific cold of the rock and the roughness of its ancient surface and the solidity of what it was and what it had been and what it now meant in the record of this canyon and the record of the people who had been inside it. He took his hand back. He turned and walked on. The canyon ran ahead of him, southward and wide, opening into the full reach of the sector that had been his territory for 18 years now, the territory he had walked in every season and every kind of weather, the territory that had given him the only understanding of a place that was worth having, which was the understanding that comes from staying long enough to learn what was really there. Not the surface of a thing, but its full dimensions. Not the comfortable version of a landscape, but the complete one, with its sealed rooms and its hidden histories and its messages scratched into concrete by people who trusted that someone, eventually, would find them and carry them forward. He had been that someone. He would continue to be that someone, walking the same ground, pressing his hand against the surfaces that felt wrong, refusing the ease of not looking, carrying what the territory asked him to carry. That was the work. That was all of it. He walked, and the canyon held him in its ancient and indifferent silence, and the morning light moved down the walls in the way it had moved every morning for longer than any record reached, and the ravens called from the ridge, and the sage was silver and sharp in the clean desert air. He walked on. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.